Ohio gozaimasu, and that means good morning if you don't know. Just admiring the artwork on this nice plane right here. But anyway, what I have before us is a small smattering of tools. You know, a little hammer, chisels, plane, pretty typical stuff for having around a shop. Also have some sharpening stones of a couple different varieties. And today I am going to cover sharpening. Now this is something that I have learned a lot about, and I've learned a lot of what not to do, but I've also learned some stuff that is very good to do. So I'm going to cover my method for sharpening. You don't have to do this as an exact clone, but I have found that there's a lot of stuff about sharpening Japanese tools that just seems extreme and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from a working perspective. So I'm just going to share my thoughts on that, but I'm also going to walk you through just a basic, very straightforward way to get a good edge on these tools. But this is also my method for any other sharp hand tool, including pocket knives, etc. This works for pretty much everything. And if you want to follow along, the only tools I've got here are a spritzer bottle for the water stones. This is a 1000 grit. This is a 5000 grit. This is an 8000 grit. I don't use the 8000 grit a whole lot. I've got some 220 adhesive sandpaper here, as well as a flat plate. You can also just use any sort of flat machined steel or a bar, whatever you have available. This is just what I have, so that's what we're going to use today. Like I said, this is going to be just what I use for my stuff. You can take from it what you will. Your mileage may vary with all this because there is not a single way to do this. Alright, so first order of business, make sure you've got a decent place to work. Now for rags, I don't actually use paper towels. I just use these mechanics rags because you do want something to wipe your tools off with. You can get these at any, car supply place. I don't know what they have around the world, but just any place that sells automotive supplies will sell these type of rags. Just kind of handy to have. Carefully set it to the side. I may go over setup on these if you guys want that. If you want a video on setting up Japanese planes, feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know because I would be happy to do that. So the chip breaker has an edge on it, but this one's pretty flat. But as you can see, that actually is sharpened and polished just a bit. And if we mate that up there, you can see it's decent fit. There's not really a gap there, so I'm not really going to cover how to set up the chip breaker because that really isn't necessary in this case. But if we're looking at this plane blade here, let me see if I can get a better shot of this. Now before we really get started on this, I'm going to show you something that I found very helpful. Knowing whether something is sharp or not is not just a matter of running your hand on an edge like this, because you can kind of feel the burr whenever something is sharp. But if you learn how to do what I call sighting an edge, and I'm going to see if I can get this camera to focus here. Now if we have an edge that has this is fine, but as we tilt the blade up, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a reflection right off the end there. Now I have put a little bit of a micro bevel on that, but you see how it's got those jagged reflections? That is actually an indication that that edge is not necessarily square and sharp. It's actually got a little bit of a flat spot there. And if you follow that around, it's very difficult to see, but you can, once you kind of know what to look for, you can't unsee it. It's kind of like seeing mistakes in movies, that sort of thing. See, right around that area there's a little bit of a reflection, which means that that spot, instead of having a straight bevel all the way down, is actually flat on that end, which means you need to sharpen it. This is an unset up chisel that kind of has a similar thing. And so if we're getting a little bit of light on it like that, and we roll it this way, you can see there's a flat spot right on that edge. And I can, I could roll my finger back and forth on that with no problem. That's pretty dull. And that's a really easy way to pick up something and tell how sharp it is without touching it, because you want that edge to be going all the way down, and you want that point that it reaches there to just kind of disappear off into infinity. If it gets to a point there and then stops, you have a little wall, and that is not sharp, and that will not work very well, except for burnishing and doing, kind of light stuff like that. But you're not going to get very good performance out of any tool that has an edge set up like that. Now this one is one that I have used excessively over the years, and it could use a little bit of a sharpen, but if we take a glance at this edge here, you'll notice, whoops, hang on, there we go, we're back in business. And if you look at this edge here, you'll notice there is not a flat spot on that edge because I did just sharpen this not too long ago. There's a little bit of chipping kind of on this corner, but I found that this metal is actually slightly brittle. And so we have a pretty good infinite edge right there. So that's what you're looking for whenever you want to see if something is sharp, just visually. It does take a little practice to do that, but once you kind of get it, you can't stop getting it. You know, it's like riding a bike. You never really forget once you learn. Okay, stone prep. Now, this is something that is kind of important, especially if you've got a brand new water stone. I've been using these for quite a while, and this is the brand that I've kind of settled on, Sharpening. Not paid for, not a paid endorsement. I bought these with my own money, and I have been using these for quite a few years now. But the first thing I would do if you've got a brand new water stone is take your diamond stone or whatever you have to flatten with. I've actually taken to using this adhesive sandpaper here. You just take a little bit of it, stick it to your stone, like so. It's not going to stick super well, but it does stick well enough for the job. And ideally, when you're doing this, you want a little bit of a bevel kind of on the edge of your stones. Now you can see I put one on this, just a little bit there. And the idea behind that is that if you've got a hard square edge here, what tends to happen is you tend to kind of push inward a little bit more on the stone. And this is just my experience, by the way. So when you have that bevel, it makes squaring up the flat back or the top a lot easier because you're not kind of fighting that edge where it's just going to randomly find a point. You can feel it kind of tilt and then you can correct for it. So before you sharpen, you do want to make sure that your stones are fairly flat. So a little spritzer bottle there. And then take your adhesive sandpaper or your diamond stone, whatever you want, and just flatten that out a good bit. I'm using 220 grit sandpaper here for this job. And as I'm doing this, you can probably see the bevels I've put on this stone a little easier as well. Alright, flat-ish, sandpaper's still good. You don't want to wipe off all the water, but you do want to be able to see where you've been cutting. Yeah, it's not so bad. Get a little bit more water on there. And now this is just a small little thing I found, but if you wipe your stone down with a rag, the stone actually is abrasive, so it kind of grabs little bits from the rag and pulls it off and leaves it on the stone. So rather than just finish with that, add a little bit more water and wipe it off with just your hand. You don't want to do this a whole lot. Like don't get in the habit of when you're sharpening of dragging your finger on it because it will remove skin. But if you have decent calluses, shouldn't be a problem. But you just want to avoid having stuff like that, which is from that rag. So you just want to make sure your surface is clear, everything's clean, wipe your hands off, etc. And now we can actually sharpen something. And so once you have that, that is a squared stone. You can see the bevels on there. You can kind of see where I've kind of touched it with tools over the years, but yeah, that is ready to use. Now, you don't have to be a maniac about getting this perfectly flat. It's pretty much a huge waste of time to do that. Rather, you want it flat enough that when you're sharpening, you can use the entire length of the stone without having one spot that's really scooped out or one spot that's tilted inward. That's what you're looking for. I haven't really found much advantage to having the stone be perfectly flat. In fact, having just the tiniest, and I mean like almost an imperceptible radius to it, won't kill your tools. But what it will do is over time, it just wears the stone out faster. So if you keep it flat, you'll get a lot more life and a lot more service out of your stones. So in my experience, I have found that with tools that have the focus, there we go. I have found that tools that have the scallop on the back, I actually do the back first. And I don't really have a whole lot of explanation for that other than the fact that once the back is kind of flat, you can sort of work the top a little bit better. And once you work the top, the burr being on this side of the edge, I have found works better than the opposite. So basically, once this is flat, you can start working the bevel. That's just me. You don't really have to dig too much into that. I have just found that they work better when you do it in that order. So, you know, just my experience. Doing the back on a Japanese chisel is very simple. Simply lay it flat like that. And you should be able to hold it with one hand. And you're going to do one stroke, like so. And I'm not going to do the entire back, and I'll explain why here in just a second. So when you're doing this, you only want to push away from yourself because you're trying to do that same repeatable motion every single time. It gives you a much more consistent cut. If you're going back and forth, you're going to press harder doing one direction than you will the other. And so that is the reason you don't do that, because what will happen is as you cut into the metal, if you're going back and forth, one side will get more worn than the other side. Now you can see on this one, we've kind of already gotten through, we've kind of gotten through that first layer there. And so I have those cut marks all the way around. Now on a Japanese chisel, you don't actually need to do the entire back. And I'll tell you why. Because I did that to test it on a single chisel. And what I found was when you're cutting any kind of mortise, if this is extremely flat, the chisel tends to do this thing where it will dive forward. So if this is your piece of wood here and you're trying to cut straight across that, if it's perfectly flat across the entire back, it tends to dive down. When you leave it just in this front portion here, you know, maybe not even halfway, that's like 3/4 inch. The narrower they are, I mean, you don't really have to be that crazy with it. When you do that, it actually helps you control it because you're just guiding it with this edge. You're not letting the whole back of the chisel just follow that one single line. When it's just this front portion, you can kind of guide it this way. So it's easier to control it when you have just this section that's flat as opposed to the entire thing. You can disagree with that. It is a matter of opinion. However, that's my experience that has taught me that. All right, so once you have your back kind of trued up like that, then we're moving on to the bevel. Now this is something that I have struggled with quite a bit, because the first way I was doing this was actually I would take the chisel like this and I would make little motions like this over the entirety of the stone. Now that works. However, what I have found is a big problem is you kind of get that, where one half is worked, the other half isn't. Now sometimes they really aren't just not square, and that's fine. However, I have found that I like this method a little bit better. Another thing that's important too, besides avoiding this, when you put your chisel on your stone, you just barely tilt it forward. This is how you find that edge. You notice that disappear, 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 and splash. That little splash right there means that you're pretty much square with the stone. And so the edge of that is just touching that surface. So if you're going to sharpen, you look for that every single time. But once you get that little splash, that's an indicator that you're at a good point. You can go past that. However, you're not actually going to be sharpening the bevel. You're going to be sharpening just that edge. So if you have kind of a chippy, newer blade, you can do that, but I'll cover that at a later point. So this is the way that I like to sharpen. You simply start, let me move this up here where you can see. Simply start there, so you get the splash, and parallel to the stone, I have found I can get a much better result. Just kind of working back and forth in little sections over the stone here. You do want to try to wear it evenly. I'm gripping very hard with my right hand. My left hand is simply guiding it. So move down one section, down again, another section. If we wipe that off, you can see now we've got a much better result across that entirety there. It is not sharp yet, so I do have quite a bit of work to do, but that's why I prefer the parallel method going this way as opposed to the angle, because I have never been able to hold it flat enough like this to get a good result with that. In some of my earlier videos, you can see me doing that, but behind the scenes, it was really a struggle to get that to work properly. But since I've started doing this method, you know, the parallel method, I have found that I get a much better result. And so we're just going to continue working here. In my right hand, I've actually got my index finger pointed down, and that's kind of my reference for the angle there. But I'm just always looking for that little splash, and then I kind of grip it really hard with the rest of my hand, and then just go to work. And I usually split the stone up into 3 sections, just like this. Now, one thing I will say is you don't want to think about grinding the edge. I think of it as cutting the edge. Because technically what these stones are doing is they're actually cutting in your edge there. Now, if you're grinding, you're just pushing the tool into the stone. But if you're cutting, you're just kind of gliding the tool over the top of the stone. So that actually helps me mentally think it through a little bit better. And it gives me a better result too, because I'm letting the stone do the work for me. I'm not having to do all the work for the stone. All right, now one thing I did want to mention actually is that while I'm working, I am not actually keeping this stone straight in front of me like that. I'm actually angling the stone just a little bit because no human is square, and so we can't expect our bodies to do perfectly square things. And so by angling the stone a little bit, and by standing here, and if I'm holding my chisel or whatever I'm sharpening like this, I get much better control over the amount of pressure that I can put, and I get much better control with my left hand as well, because it's a more natural position for my left hand to be here as opposed to being right here, kind of bunched up and scrunched like that. We're making some good progress on that. I've almost eliminated the flat portion here entirely. Now there is a section here that didn't get touched. It's not actually critical that you get the entire section up here polished and sharp. It's only critical that you keep the edge as square as possible to the rest of that body. You can see that's fairly square. So if you have a little section here that didn't get touched, don't worry about it. A lot of this stuff is handmade, and you're going to get varieties of, actually not varieties, you're going to get variations in how square things are or how well cut things are as far as angles go. So not a big deal to have something like that as long as your edge is fully square and is fully sharp. All right, after a good bit of elbow work, we have a decently sharp edge. And I can take this and I can roll it like I was talking about earlier, looking for that flat spot, and we have no flat spot, which is a solid thing. And also you can kind of feel the burr too. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with doing this. It's just visually, if you're able to see it, it does help you a good bit. Now, something I should mention as well. What if you have a blade that is actually offset a little bit or skewed, meaning one side of the edge is longer than the other side? Well, with the 45-degree angle, you can actually kind of get this nice thing where you can sort of control it with your left hand just by pushing on one corner of the blade versus the other corner. With the parallel method, what I have actually found is more useful is rather than pushing with your bearing hand, I don't know what you'd call that, rather than doing that, a slight tilt with your right hand or your left hand, your dominant, like that, whatever you're holding it with, actually will help you get a better result. So if I'm going to demonstrate here, put a little bit more water on this. Whoops. I'm going to demonstrate that really quick. If we're just, like, let's say for example we have this corner here is a little bit longer than this one, so it's kind of sitting in an angle like that, and we want it to be a little more square, simply get it started, and then as you're pushing, I push a little bit more on this side. I'm exaggerating here just so you can see. But if we push just a little bit harder on this side, like that, and then you just repeat like normal, just wearing in those 3 spots like that. I'm trying the whole time to try to hold the blade parallel to the edge of the stone on this side, so using that as a reference point can help you stay square. But if we're looking at it, you can see I got a little bit more wear here than I did previously. It's actually really hard to see. But anyway, if you have a blade that is out of square slightly, that is a way to correct it using the parallel method. And like I said, the 45 is fine if you can do that. I've never been able to do that. So your mileage may vary, but use what you like. And so one more thing, as you're working, if you leave some of the metal, you actually can get kind of a slight polishing effect on your edge. I'm not really like super into that. I mean, I've done it a little bit because it is just kind of hard to avoid it, but typically I don't like to leave metal bits on my stones, so I will wipe them off because they will rust over time. and you do not want rust in your stone. You got to get those little bits off of there, like so. Always make sure your stone is clean. So one thing I don't like about those cloths, they do leave these little bits on the stone, but paper towels do it worse, so. There we go, just rinse, rinse, rinse. And this stone's actually not worn really enough to warrant it, but flattening is always a good idea. I know it seems a little weird to use the sandpaper over just using the diamond stone, but I don't like how the diamond stone gets really sticky. For some reason with these stones, as you cut and abrade, it sticks, even if it's not flat. And it's impossible to move it and you end up swirling around all over the place. The sandpaper is a lot more aggressive, so it cuts a little bit cleaner. But what you don't get is you don't get, lifting your stone out of your base there. So that's just my little tidbit for that, and you don't have to do it. So for me, it's easier to have a roll of adhesive sandpaper. This is like a 220 grit. If you go past like 400, it gets to be too smooth and the stones won't actually work right. So 220 grit I have found is more than enough to make that work properly. And we're gonna let that one dry because we're gonna move on to something else here. Now, I use the same sort of idea for plane blades. Now this one is not especially dull, but let's see if I can chase this over here and show you. There is a bit of a rolled edge right there. There you go. You can kind of see that reflection. So just on this corner here, there's a lot of rolled edge. So we're going to work this corner here. Now with plane blades, they're really, really wide, and so they do take a little bit more practice, but it's not that much different from a chisel. Now if I'm doing a chisel, because they're longer, they're a little bit more difficult to handle, I keep the stone turned like this. If I'm doing a plane blade, which is much wider and much just different shape, a much different shape, I actually will turn the stone a little bit more this way. And what that does is for my right hand, or whatever your holding hand is, I can get a little bit more control this way, and I'm not having to do as much adjustment with my hand like that. When you have a chisel, your hand's way back here, so you have a little bit less control, you have a little bit more control, but when you don't have that length, you lose that control. So being able to kind of choke up like that is a really good way to kind of keep your body working for you, and you avoid, turning or twisting the blade and getting a weird offset edge. So sharpening a kana or a plane blade is much the same as a chisel, except like I said, I do like to tilt the stone a little bit more angled, a little bit more angled towards my dominant hand. And whenever I am pressing with it, I'm going to do the same thing. So if you're looking, get that little splash effect there. So you find the edge, and if we're sighting this, there was the one edge here that is the more rolled section. So rather than try to make a perfectly square edge, you do want a slight radius to these edges. And so I simply hold the plane like that, my thumb and my index finger, and then I can kind of guide it with my left hand like this. So holding the blade is quite a bit different than a chisel. I usually will hold it like this with my ring finger or my middle finger hooked under like that. You're not trying to really press it into the stone. Like I said earlier, think about cutting the edge rather than grinding the edge. But holding it this way, I have good control side to side, forward and back, whatever angle I need to hold it to. So if we're going to start, I just find the little splash point like we talked about before. And with my non-holding hand, I'm actually going to apply a little more pressure on this side than I am this side. And for each stroke, I like to go roughly the length of the blade times 2. So if I'm thinking about it like thinking about it in measurements, if my blade starts here, hold my finger there, times 2. So that's the length of the stroke that I'm shooting for. So if you're watching here, we're just pressing a little bit with the right side like that. Just kind of wearing back and forth on that stone. And I'm not pressing very hard. I'm just holding with my my gripping hand is holding a lot tighter than my left hand. My right hand is holding a lot tighter than my left hand is. Then we're going to move up here, kind of do the same thing. And so I'm just splitting the stone up into 2 spaces rather than 3 spaces. And the reason for that is so I can maintain the consistent stroke. with each pass rather than having to worry about doing smaller strokes. You will be more accurate over smaller sections than you will be on large sections. However, this is the way that I have found works for me. And plus, there is something to be said about keeping the same advantage for, or the same technique for both planes and chisels. Keeps you more consistent that way. So if we're sighting this, you can see we just worked that one side there. Let's see if we can get a shot of, we have eliminated the dull spot there. So that's great. Now we can move on to sharpening the whole thing, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about something that's really critical. Now if we're sighting that edge here, let me clean this off here, we don't actually want this to be perfectly square. We want there to be just the slightest little radius going this way over that edge. And in this light, you can probably see it. And let me see if I can, you can't quite get that focus to show that there. But you don't want it to be perfectly square, because if it's perfectly square, your edges are actually going to dig into whatever you're cutting and you're going to leave streak marks. So the way you would get rid of that is just putting a little bit more pressure on one pass on one side, then another pass on the other side. And I'll show you how to do that. So if we're going to put our radius in, do the same thing, get down to your splash point there, and we need to add a little bit more water to this one. This is getting a little bit, you also want to keep your space as clean as you can. Getting a little bit dry there. And so I'm going to do the same thing I did before. However, one side of the stone is going to be used for the right side, and the other side is going to be used for the left side on the blade. So if I'm holding this here, I'm pressing on the right side of the blade for this section. Kind of counting, so that's one pass, two passes. And so once I'm at two, I'm going to switch up here, and I'm going to change pressure to the left side of the blade. I'm just kind of using my ring finger for that. There's one pass, two passes, go back and switch. And when you kind of feel like you've got it worn in evenly enough, you do one pass per side, switch. This is a bit of a hand workout, so if you don't have good hand strength, this is something you will need to work on. So now I'm going to try to press evenly on both sides as much as possible. One pass, two passes, just kind of working back and forth on the stone like that. And you can see how much material we're actually removing. So after a little bit of that, you can see we have an even grind across the face of that. We have just the slightest radius, and I almost can't, it's almost imperceptible on the camera there. If you're looking at it in person without having to autofocus, you can definitely see it. But there's a little, and I mean just the slightest radius on that. And you can see how consistent that color is on that. So I'm happy with that one. And we have a good edge there. Now the thing with plane blades, I typically don't like to just constantly grind down this face here, because over time you will get to the point where you have to tap out an edge. I might do a video on tapping out actually if you guys want to see that. Anyway, the main thing for me is that working this bevel is actually the side that you want to work versus working this side. You don't want to thin this, because this is where all your good steel is. That's where your cutting edge is going to be. So you do want to work the bevel more than anything else, but you do want to be careful not to overwork things as you would with anything else. But yeah, that's consistently sharp on that. Okay, now I'm going to clean up the stone and we're going to keep going forward here. But I do want to share with you some dirty secrets. All right, dirty secret number one. You do not have to sharpen past 1,000 grit for a plane to work. In fact, you can get a nice sheen surface with just 1,000 grit. So if you're just smoothing and you're trying to do actual work and not really show off or finish, 1,000 grit will do just fine. All right, so that's kind of the big dirty secret, is that you don't need to go to 10,000 grit to get a decently finished surface like that. 1,000 grit is actually plenty. Now, I wasn't really trying to be super precise with that. As you can see, some of the shavings are kind of lopsided like I showed earlier, but you can actually finish a nice piece of wood, nicely smoothed, with just, 1,000 grit. And that seems a little controversial, but I have done it with 800 grit. I haven't quite got it with 600, but you could probably do so if you really wanted to. Now, I'm not going to do any hammering because it's early in the morning, but if you have an edge that is cut with 1,000 grit, you can just as easily pare, you can cut, you can take shavings, you can do chipping, you can mortise it out, whatever you want. And I'm kind of going against the grain here on this one, so. But even if we were to hammer that out, you can still get pretty deep in there. I gotta be really careful, I don't want to wake the boys up too early. But anyway, that's the first dirty secret about this stuff, is you don't have to have a 10,000 grit mirror polish finish to get any kind of performance out of these tools. They will work with what you have. You just have to do the work and make sure you sharpen them well. They're not going to work well if you roll the edge, if you have too steep of an edge, or if you don't do a consistent job of sharpening, meaning you have a dull spot and a sharp spot. Those things are what make the difference. It's not the stones, it's not necessarily any sort of old mystic technique, or even sharpening it to anime levels of katana sharpness or whatever the TV shows will tell you. It is just about getting a consistent edge that is sharp enough, and I can't get this to focus here. Sorry, new camera woes. Let me know, focus. There we go. It's just about getting a consistent edge, and it's just about making sure that you do your job as a sharpener and as a woodworker, and the tools will do the rest. So to summarize, don't buy into the myth that you need all the way up to 10,000 or 20,000 mirror polish. If you want internet points, that's the way to do it, but if you want to do this in the real world, you ain't got time for that. There's just no way you can sharpen every tool to that level every single time you're going to use it. So, there you go. All right, now all that being said, if you do want to put a little bit more fine finish on your tools, this is a way to do it. We're going to go over that with a 5,000 stone here. This has been my finishing stone for pretty much since I started doing this stuff. And I found personally there's not really much reason to try to go past 5,000 unless you just really, really want to. But me, with my job requiring sharp tools, I have never had time to take things past 5,000. There we go. All right, so putting a little finish edge on chisels is pretty simple. I start with the back, and I'm just going to repeat like I did before. Take that, one direction, push on the edge. And try to line it up with where you had it squared up earlier on the rougher stone. Go. And I'm just pushing with my left hand and kind of guiding with my right. If we're looking at that, there, pretty decent. So once you get the back kind of polished, I basically repeat the same thing I would do with the rougher stone. Guide it down till you get your little splash. And then just rinse and repeat. Now, I wouldn't use a finer stone to try to correct any sort of out of squareness or anything like that. You'd be there all night long. Plus it's just kind of weird. That's not really what these are for. So I just do about half the number of passes or till I get the edge that I need to. And we're a little bit lopsided in the middle there, but Could probably get that with some more work. Now, the one thing I will say is that a finer edge does last a little bit longer than a rougher edge. However, I have not found any need, like I said, to go past 5,000 grit, because 5,000 is pretty fine in the grand scheme of things. And plus, going up to mirror polish, I mean, if you're not using it to pull your nose hairs out, I don't really see a need to do that. Your mileage may vary though. I mean, if that's your thing, you might as well. Yeah, we're making some good progress on that. Just about down to that edge. And I think what happened is with the rougher stone, I think I rolled that edge just a little tiny bit. However, it is still pretty sharp, so. And one thing I also don't do is I don't spend a lot of time trying to make sure that I have the perfect ratio of water on these things. I just make sure they have enough water to where I don't feel the tool kind of dragging, if that makes sense. The water is simply a lubricant, just like oil is for an engine. So you don't want to feel rough spots, you don't want to feel dragging. And that's really all you're looking for. Alright, so now I've got a nice shine all the way down. And that's kind of what I would consider a finished sharpening. I don't really go past that much, and that is kind of mirror-y. Yeah, you can see that. It's got a decent amount of mirror to it. There we go. And now for a plain blade, I just kind of rinse and repeat of what I did before. Just making sure to emphasize that slight radius I talked about. Same grip as before. Not really about speed, but it is about getting consistency. With a wider edge, it always is a little bit more difficult. There's not really any other way to slice that. Let me do a little spot check here. Yeah, we're about good on that. Not going to look that much different, but I can definitely feel it. Alright, so a good bit of work. We have a sharp edge. Here I was kind of singing a little bit. That's one way you can also tell. But we have consistency. We have maintained our little radius. Yeah, you can kind of see how nicely polished that is too there. Anyway, so that is that's literally all I do for plain blades and chisel blades for that stuff. And as a side note, if you want a really cheap cleanup, you can actually use wood chips to kind of clean these off. Like so. You know, if you're really, really, really poor, that would be a good option for you. But they do a pretty decent job. Now, if you guys do want to see a video on setting up a plane, I would be happy to do that at some point. I don't know when though, because, you know, schedules notwithstanding, children are basically the priority these days. So I may not have mentioned it earlier, but if you bought a nice handmade Japanese chisel like this one, you are probably going to find that there are some actual inconsistencies with it. Now, this one is sharp. This is a consistent bevel on this side. However, the edge of this was not actually ground perfectly flat. It was actually ground at a bit of an angle. And so you can see this spot here was rolled really far back and this spot was rolled too far forward. So if you get an edge that looks like this, that is perfectly fine. All you're looking for, like I said, it's all about maintaining that edge consistency. You can see I did the same amount here, and it's a consistent edge, and that's all you're really looking for. None of this up here really matters. It's kind of that first little quarter of the edge that really dictates how most of this stuff cuts. Something else that you're going to find a lot of stuff written about is what angle should you sharpen at? Well, I have never once in my entire time doing this measured the angle of a bevel on any chisel of any type, nor have I measured one on a plane. My rule is always, if you're using a plane or you're using a chisel, if the edge chips while you're using it, you need to increase the angle, meaning you need to add more of an angle going this way. Now, if it doesn't chip, you can bring the angle back a little bit further from whatever it is currently cut. So just keep that in mind. If the edge chips, bring the bevel up. If the edge doesn't chip, you can bring the bevel down. Shallower bevels cut better for paring. Higher bevels, or deeper bevels, cut better for mortising and hammering through stuff. However, you can pair with a mortising chisel, as I have done many times, even with this one. Okay, so it's been a few days since I was able to finish this video. That last little clip you saw was from about 3 days ago. So, to pick up where I left off, now planes have the blade sitting at a little different angle than a chisel. A chisel, you can kind of dictate whatever angle you want. So there is the possibility that with a plane blade, that if you get the angle too high, it simply will not cut. So you do want to shoot for a lower bevel on plane blades. But even with these, I have never measured the angle of any of these blades ever. It's just something I don't do. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but if you have a plane that doesn't cut, maybe take a look at that angle and make sure that it's actually appropriate for where it's sitting in the body, because you do have to consider that this actually dictates a whole lot of how that edge will cut and how it meets the wood. So that is a consideration. But that actually concludes this video. And I'm going to recap this for you. So, dirty secret number 1. You do not have to have any crazy special sharpening tools. You don't have to go past 1,000 grit if you don't want to. And you don't even have to have water stones. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing in my opinion. Now you do have to have something to level your stones with, so a diamond stone with some adhesive sandpaper is perfectly fine. Or if you can hold the sandpaper square against that, you just don't want to be doing it with your bare hands, because then that's not going to be square at all. No human is square, as I had said before. And so when it comes to changing this out, sometimes you will get little bits that kind of tear off. A little bit of mineral spirits, or naphtha as some people call it, will take that right off and you'll be good to go. If there's something specific you have a question about, I will try to answer it in the comments down below, so feel free to ask questions. Feel free to, question what I'm doing here. This is not, to me, this isn't any sort of mysterious art. It's carpentry, but it's just using slightly different tools. In conclusion, I hope you guys have an awesome day. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something from it too. I am not a professional carpenter. I'm just a guy who enjoys doing this stuff. So I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do. Arigatou gozaimasu. Sayonara.